This week, the King of Jordan will meet with President Biden at the White House. Jordan is a key ally of the U.S. and for the past 30 years has had a peace treaty with Israel. We spoke with his partner, Queen Rania al Abdullah of Jordan, on Thursday. She's of Palestinian descent and an advocate for children. We began our conversation on the impact of the war between Israel and Hamas and America's role in the region.
People view the U.S. as being party to this war because, Israeli officials say that without a U.S. support, they couldn't launch this war. You turn off the tap and the weapons dry out. So there's been anger in our part of the world, not at just what's happening, but at the world's reaction. When we see these violations, human rights violations and international law violations, and we're watching the world letting it happen. When October 7th happened, the world rightfully condemned it and took strong action and strong positions. We are outraged that the same is not happening when Palestinians are getting killed. And so there is a sense of the selective application of humanitarian law and a sense of unfairness, a sense of our lives don't matter as much.
You said people back home see the United States as complicit in what's happening?
They see it as an enabler, So clearly the U.S. is the country that has most leverage over the U.S., over Israel. And like I said, it is the biggest ally and biggest supporter. And the Arab world is getting, the rest of the world actually is getting mixed messages. So on the one hand, the U.S. is demanding that more aid rightfully go back into Gaza. At the same time, they're denying that the starvation is intentional. On the one hand, they are outraged by the attacks on the aid convoys, but at the same time, they're denying that Israel is violating international humanitarian law. There's an expression of concern over civilian deaths, but at the same time, there's a provision of offensive weapons to Israel that are used against Palestinians. When you try so hard to thread the needle, you can risk dropping the ball. You can risk letting your values and principles unravel. And that has a deep impact. Either everyone is accountable or no one is. So the next time a country breaks the rules, and the U.S. comes and tries to apply more authority, those countries are going to say, well, you made an exception here, so why apply it to us? I think Gaza now is like a microcosm of our New World disorder, of the breakdown of international norms, of the return of might is right. And I think that's very dangerous, not just for our region, but for the entire world.
Recently, President Biden, just about a month ago, warned Prime Minister Netanyahu that U.S. policy would change if Israel's behavior and conduct in this war didn't change. Do you believe the U.S. is starting to use the leverage you say it has?
Well, look, there's definitely been a change in tone and language. And you're right, the president has been warning and has been trying very hard to persuade Netanyahu, for example, to not enter Rafah. But we've seen time and again Israeli officials not heeding the warnings or counsel or advice of allies. So I think it's time that the international community, including the U.S., really use its political leverage to compel Israel to end the war and to let aid in. And it's by standing up for international law, saying, for example, the building of illegal settlements is wrong and it has to stop. It's by saying that, we are not going to provide you with offensive weapons. It's by saying we're not going to continue to use our veto to not hold Israel accountable when it breaks the law. Diplomatic pressure is also very, very important. So there are many tools that the U.S. has in order to compel Israel to do the right thing. And I think for the sake of our world, the U.S. may be Israel's most closest ally, but a good friend holds a friend accountable.
You argued people need to understand that Palestinian mothers love their children just as much as Israeli mothers. Why do you feel like that needed to be said?
Well, because, for decades, the dehumanization of Palestinians has been an intentional approach that Israel adopted in order to numb people to Palestinian suffering. It's actually quite surprising to see just how deep the undercurrents of dehumanizations run. Arabs are generally accused of teaching hate, and Palestinians as well. But Israelis have actually walled Palestinians out of sight and out of mind. It's kind of reduced them to nameless, faceless security threats that you have to defend yourself against.
To see Hamas as representing Palestinian people, you're saying, is wrong.
Absolutely wrong. And also just to point out that most of the people alive in Gaza today were not alive when Hamas was elected. They were either they were not born or they were children at the time. So absolutely, Hamas does not represent the majority of Palestinians. And if Palestinians hate Israelis, it is not because of their religion or their identity. It's because of the fact that they've only interacted with them as enforcers of a military state. They have only known them through their checkpoints and bullets and guns. It's not something that's inherently in them against Jewish people. In fact, I always try to remind people that, we have coexisted, Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people for the longest time.
Well, historians will argue anti-Semitism has been present throughout history, right?
Yes.
And it is hard for people to hear some of what you are saying and not react in that way, where they hear a characterization of criticism of the Israeli government or the Israeli military and see where you're separating from Jewish people. Right. A lot of people don't hear a difference.
Anti-Semitism is absolutely present, and it's been on the rise, it's been on the surge, and it is the worst kind of bigotry. It is pure hatred, and I always say that Muslims have to be at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism, because Islamophobia is the other side of the same disease, and it's also on the rise. Judaism is a religion of peace, and the issue is when you try to conflate anti-Israeli policy with anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is when you persecute somebody or you discriminate against somebody based on their Jewish identity. Israel is a state. It has political policy, political parties. So you can criticize the state of Israel, but that's not necessarily anti-Semitism. So when people stand up and speak against the war in Gaza, when they're talking about speak against the collective punishment, when you deprive people of food as a weapon of war, when an entire population is displaced, when there's indiscriminate bombing, that is not anti-Semitism. That is speaking against Israeli policy. And I think it would be wrong to hold the Jewish community responsible for the actions of or the policies of Israel.
How are young people in Jordan thinking about this right now? I mean, what is the sentiment in terms of the American unconditional support for the government of Israel?
I have to say, in one word, there's outrage. There is outrage because, for most young people, even those who maybe were against American foreign policy or whatever, or disagreed with it, we always looked up to the U.S., as a country of a democratic country with democratic values, with application of law, with freedom of speech, with, human rights, etc. And as I said, the young people are now feeling extremely disillusioned. How can this be happening while the U.S. is allowing it to happen, while the rest of the world is allowing it to happen?
Well, the Director of National Intelligence in this country, Avril Haines, testified saying there will be a generational impact from the war in Gaza. And that was also a gesture to terror recruitment. How concerned are you that that is what may happen to some of these young people who you say are just inundated with images of what's happening?
It's not just the people who are on the extreme that are being enraged by this. It's people who are in the middle as well, people who are westernized, people who studied here, people who are suddenly just looking at the world and saying, they're so disillusioned. They're saying, clearly there are different standards, that humanitarian law is applied selectively and that our lives don't matter. And that it's okay for almost 15,000 children to be killed, 19,000 to be orphaned. It's okay for the infrastructure to be obliterated. It's okay to stop the delivery of aid and food to an entire population. That is collective punishment. It's a war crime, and it's happening. And so the young people are saying, I guess the West doesn't like us. So in my opinion, this is probably one of the largest recruitment events that we've seen in recent history.
What you are describing is what Defense Secretary Austin warned Israel about, that you could have a tactical win and a strategic loss in the long term. That's what I hear you saying, that this will lead to more terror recruitment.
Absolutely. Is this war making Israel safer? Is it making our world safer? I would argue, after 35,000 people dead, after the obliteration of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, after the violations of so much, after the rhetoric that we're hearing, from Israeli officials, calling Palestinians human animals, or saying, when the prime minister says that Palestinians are children of darkness, that they only understand the rules of the jungle, when officials say we need to find a more effective way than death to inflict suffering on Palestinians. How is that making Israel safer? I mean, how? Peace is not about politics only, it's about people. Israelis are surprised when the word genocide is used because they cannot see Palestinians as anything but as a security threat, that they deserve what's happening to them. In a poll
They're traumatized after October 7th.
Absolutely traumatized, I understand that. And I understand that because of my own background, that I would identify with the Palestinian side more. And because of that, I challenge myself every single day to put myself in the shoes of an Israeli mother who has a child that's been taken as hostage, or any young Israeli who has been taught and who's heard of the horrible persecution that the Jewish people have had to endure in Europe. And I try to empathize and see where they're coming from. And absolutely, we need the hostages to go home as soon as possible. And we need the war to end as soon as possible so that Palestinians can go back to their homes if they have homes left. So I understand that what happened on October 7th was traumatic and devastating for Israeli society. But the reaction to it has not helped the situation. You cannot just rely on this visceral reaction of retribution and revenge. Israel could have retaliated through surgical strikes against Hamas, but that's not what we're seeing today.
The Biden administration is also expected to report to Congress by Wednesday whether or not Israel's complying with international law in its use of U.S.-provided weapons and whether it is blocking U.S. aid. You can see our full interview with Queen Rania on our website, facethenation.com, and our YouTube page.